This is the Smart Buildings Academy podcast with Phil Zito, episode 285. Hey folks, Phil Zito here, and welcome to episode 285 of the Smart Buildings Academy podcast. And in this episode, we're going to be discussing how to create submittals and project documents. So if you've been following this series, this is, I think, like the fourth episode in our series on project management and project execution. So if you are of the operations or technical side of the business, you're definitely going to want to listen to these episodes because it's really going to make clear to you exactly how projects are executed, what deliverables are required during the execution of projects, how to manage those deliverables, and you're going to get some tips and tricks along the way. As always, all the resources mentioned can be found at podcast.smartbuildingsacademy.com/285. Once again, that's podcast.smartbuildingsacademy.com/285. And I just have one request. For those of you who have been taking, a lot of value out of this podcast, if you could just take, 30 seconds to a minute and go over to iTunes or wherever you're listening to this and leave a 5-star review for the podcast. That will really help it reach other people because of the algorithms that are used. It will then be shared with more people as potential podcasts for them to listen to. So I would really appreciate it if you wouldn't mind going and doing that for us. All right, so let's talk through this. So I'm not going to assume you understand what submittals and project documents are. So we're going to go through those first. Then we're going to talk through what's required. Then we are going to talk about how we find out what's required. And then we're going to go through each individual piece of submittals and project documents that you're going to be producing and kind of how to produce them and how to approach it. So what are submittals and project documents? Submittals are the interpretation of the building automation contractor of the designer or owner's intent for the project. So typically what will happen is we will get a MEP, mechanical, electrical, plumbing set of drawings. Usually these will be released for construction. Sometimes they'll be during the CD phase. So basically in construction, right, we have where the architect comes along and they create basically with the engineer a set of schematics that are based on the architectural drawings. And it's mainly the engineer who builds all this. And then from there, the schematic design goes through and then we create a development design, right? And then from there, it's a construction design. And once the construction design is approved, the plans are released for construction. And this goes along with the specifications. So whereas the plans are kind of the visual representation of where everything is going to be laid out and kind of how it works, the specification is going to detail out the details, like what products are we using, how should these products operate, and how should we go and communicate that information in the form of submittals. So submittals interpret all of that information, and the controls company will interpret that information into what are called submittals, and they will submit them to the engineer of record for review, and they will typically submit accompanying project documents and product documents that are required as part of the submittal. Now, this is all detailed typically in section 1 of your division specification. So that's the general section, and it'll typically about halfway down of the general section, there will be submittal document requirements. It'll typically say how many submittals are required, what form they need to be in, what information they need to include, when they need to be submitted, and any project dependencies that rely on submittal approval. Like, for example, you can't order material or execute labor or do your first billing until submittals are approved. That's why oftentimes when I'm thinking of cash flow in my projects, and if you've listened to the past episodes, you know that my philosophy is we need to get our projects positively cash flowing as soon as possible so we are not working off the capital of the business. Rather, we are running the project as its own profit and loss center, and we are profitably generating cash that is going to basically pay for our labor, pay for our subs, and pay for our material. And the biggest barrier, I wanted to say gate, but the biggest barrier to that is going to be submittal approval. That is what's going to divide us from kind of moving into project execution mode. And oftentimes, the construction documents on which our salespeople are bidding, because they're either bidding on CDs or on actual released for construction documents, oftentimes we are behind the eight ball when we are brought onto a project. That's why it's always kind of jokingly said that everyone's waiting on controls, as we have to go and interpret these documents, and then we have to go and provide our submittals, and then we have to wait for our submittals to either get rejected or approved, and then we can finally start executing work. I'm going to teach you some tips and tricks that hopefully will get your submittal approval rate significantly higher than what it is now. And I'll also teach you some things that you could do to get your submittal rate higher, but that I don't necessarily think is in the best interest of your business. So I'll kind of delineate between the two. So what is required? Like, what is required for submittals? At the basic of the basic, we need to have a representation of how we are going to implement our controls, where we're going to implement our controls, and what our controls are going to do. Now, that can look very different depending on the engineer. I've seen stuff that you literally copy and paste the one-line diagrams and the sequence of operations off of the MEP set, which I don't recommend doing. But I've seen people do that and put them in their submittal decks and get submittals approved because they're literally copying and pasting. And sometimes that can work. So if you're doing, equipment-based controls and you're just mapping those in via BACnet, sometimes that works just fine, especially if it's a low-risk sequence that can easily be executed via, factory-mounted or embedded controls on pieces of equipment. When you get into complex sequences, though, and you're relying on embedded controls, you need to be careful. And that's when you want to do your due diligence. And that's one of the areas I said, like, you can totally just copy and paste and get approval from a lot of engineers. At the same time, that can really backfire, especially if those sequences aren't fully vetted and you haven't done any RFCs and RFIs, requests for clarifications, requests for information, to verify why this sequence is like kind of goofy. Like, we'll turn on the fan and then open the outside air damper. I mean, I haven't seen it that bad, but I have seen some things where I'm like, there's no way this can work. I'm looking at the points list for this piece of equipment and you want me to control it and do stuff, but it doesn't have controllable points, or it doesn't even have those points. And we would have to add them. And then we'd have a sequence on top of a sequence, which that's the worst thing you can do, right? Is have a controller that is embedded in the piece of equipment that's controlling the equipment, and then have a separate BAS controller external to that controlling other parts of the equipment, and the two aren't communicating. And it can just cause for a lot of nightmare scenarios. So how do you find out what's required? Well, for our submittal requirements, you're going to go into Section 1 general category of your specification, at least if you're here in the United States. Now, for your sequence, for your one lines, for your equipment list, etc., you're going to turn to several different things. You're going to have your scope of work and your proposal document from your sales team. That should be guiding you. You're going to have your MEP set and the equipment schedule in the MEP set, and hopefully some one lines in the MEP set as well. And then in the specification, you're going to have Section 2, which is going to be materials or products, depending on what they call it. And that is going to clarify exactly what material and what products you are allowed to use for your bill of material. Now, a bill of material is a term we use quite often in controls, and I find some folks don't know what it means if they're brand new. So let's clarify that real quick. So bill of materials, quite simply, all bill of materials is it is a list of materials. If you think of bill of goods, right? Or if you think of just your itemized bill from a restaurant, right? It lists out everything you bought, your drinks, your food, etc. Well, bill of materials is nothing more than a list of materials. And that is something that is going to be shaped by Section 2 of the specification, right? So you got that. And then Section 3 of the specification, execution, that sometimes will detail out your sequence of operations. It will also sometimes detail out your point-to-point and functional test sheets, which may be required, by Section 1. So you can start to see the interrelationships between Section 1, Section 2, and Section 3 of the specification, and the MEP set and its equipment schedules and its notes, etc. So how do we go about executing our submittals, and what do we need to execute? Well, the first thing we need to do is the main page. And the main page should have the project name on it, right? You should know the project name and the address. That's kind of important. It should have a unique project number that you can refer back to that is in your database. It should also have a list of the architect, GC, engineer, MEP, and it should have your revision on there, what revision it is. That way, at a glance, you get all the contact info you need. So your subs are sitting out there or one of your techs is out there. They can look at this main page on the document and they will know everyone's phone number, who they are, who they need to contact, etc. And then later on, when your customers are like trying to do a retrofit or something, they'll know everyone who was working on this project. So from there, we move to the legend. I don't always include legends on my submittals as a separate page. I'll normally include a legend if necessary on the individual pages. So this is, developer preference, right? If it's required in the specification, then definitely do it. And that's one of the things, right? Don't be stupid. Like if your specification says to have a separate legend page, don't be, well, I know better than them. I'm going to put the legend on the individual pages. I mean, put the legend on the individual pages and then put it on its separate legend page. There's no reason to get your submittals rejected for silly stuff like that. And I see that happen too often where people are so stuck in their processes and ways of creating submittals for their organization that they literally, it's just kind of mindless work. And it honestly, on a lot of these controls jobs, it does become mindless work because, and I know this gets people upset and this gets people like all fired up, and I get emails and messages about it, but this isn't rocket science. The majority of what we do is pretty simple. VAV boxes, rooftops, and some air-cooled chillers. Occasionally we'll get centrifugal chillers. Occasionally we'll get some fancy AHUs with recovery and ventilators and dual ducts and all that jazz. But most of the time, we have fairly simple systems. And so we can get stuck in the routine and just kind of moving along, and we can miss things like a legend or maybe functional test sheets or whatever. So next up is the item called the riser. Now, the riser, I honestly don't know where the term riser comes from. It'd be very interesting if someone replied in the comments and was like, Phil, this is where riser comes from. But a riser is both your IP network and your serial network layout, right? It is a layout, and here's what I like to have on it. I like to have the serial network laid out. I like to have what controllers what, where's that controller located, what's its address, and I like to have them addressed sequentially, especially if you're using MSTP. That does speed up the communication just a little bit. I like to have that detailed out. That way I can understand kind of what controller I'm dealing with, where it's going to be, how it's going to be. Then I like to have my IP addresses. I like to have my subnets, masks, everything, right? I like to have that laid out, and any hardware devices that I'm going to have, any host devices like servers, computers, etc. I have all that laid out on my riser, and I also like to have a master bill of materials for my fourth tier and third tier products, right? So those are my supervisory devices and my servers, second, third, and fourth tier. So that would be servers, supervisory devices, and field controllers. And I have that listed out on my bill of materials so that I have an idea of what is contained in this project. And sometimes you'll have multiple risers. You may have a riser by floor. You may have a riser by building. It just depends on how you want to approach that and what is in, yes, the specification documents. Then we move to the system diagram. The system diagram, also known as the one-line diagram. This is a one line of ductwork, of piping, whatever, and it has the associated controls devices on the one line. So fan status, fan command, mixed air temp sensor, discharge air temp sensor, pressure sensor, etc. You can create a system diagram for each individual unique system. So if you have, 15 air handlers that are typical of one, right? They're all the same. or sorry, typical of 15, I guess. Yeah, would it be that? I don't know. I can't remember if it's typical of 1 for 15 or typical of 15 for 1. I feel like it's typical of 15 for 1. But basically, that system diagram, you'd only draw it once. You wouldn't do 15 of them. Now, with that system diagram, what I like to do is I like to put the one line, I like to put the bill of material, and I like to put the sequence of operations all on a single page, if possible. And the reason I like to do that is that when I'm out in the field and I'm doing functional tests, even though I'm going to have my functional test sheets, even though I'm going to have my point-to-point sheets, I can still be reading the sequence and looking at the system all at the same time. And that just makes life a lot easier. But for some of you, that system diagram is going to be a very big drawing, and you'll put the sequence on a separate page. Sometimes also the sequence is required on a separate page. And there is some benefits to having the sequence on the separate page, which is that if you have to redline the sequence, you are just editing that one drawing, and you're not going and having to potentially mess with everything else and resize things. Because, you go and maybe you add a paragraph to the sequence, and now all of a sudden that makes your page bigger, and now you're trying to figure out, how do I adjust my one line so that it can fit in here still? And it just becomes kind of a nightmare. So you avoid that by having a separate sequence page. And some people prefer that. Next up is the controller or panel layout. So typically what will happen is most of our controllers will not be in panels. They'll be equipment mounted or mounted in an equipment panel, which we don't really have any control over. So I will often do controllers on their own diagram with the bill of materials. And then instead of showing the wires going to the devices, I'll have wires going to electrical detail numbers. And these numbers will correspond to my master electrical detail page. And this electrical detail page will detail out, guess what? The electrical details of my controller installation. So that way I don't have to draw 50 relay terminations for a single pole double throw relay. I can just do it once as an electrical detail and reference that. And if you do that right, it becomes really nice because you build up this master list of electrical details, and it gets very clean. And then on every project, you just reference that electrical detail list and you add new electrical details as needed. And you train your electricians on the electrical details. You'll get a much better installation. You'll get better installation. You'll get easier to understand the installation, etc. So on that controller panel layout, you'll do that. And I also like to have a bill of materials, but on this bill of materials, I like to have the individual field devices. So the IO, right? The inputs and outputs. I like to list all of this out. So submittals, right? The initial submittal design is going to be main page, legend, riser, system diagram, sequence, controller / panel layout, bill of materials, and electrical details. Now, that's where a lot of folks stop and they submit stuff and then they get it rejected because they didn't include things like catalog sheets, which describe the individual pieces of equipment and the individual IO devices and everything like that. That is often required as part of your submittal package. Additionally, any specific installation documents, these are often required. Any, software documents that may be required are required. Also, point-to-point checkout sheets. So if you're building your bill of materials, kind of like how we teach in our design course, where you're using a master Excel sheet and you build your bill of materials and then you basically embed that master Excel sheet into the Visio diagram, then you can actually build your point-to-point checkout sheets at the same time as building your bill of materials, because it's additional columns to the right that you hide on the submittal documents, but you just print out the actual Excel sheet documents for your point-to-point checkout sheets. And that's how I like to kind of kill two birds with one stone. And then finally, we have functional test sheets. And these are the most difficult because functional test is something, in my opinion, you should do on every major piece of equipment, whether it's required in the project or not. So we're talking air handlers, chillers, boilers, etc. You don't need to do it necessarily for terminal units. You could just spot check those. But if you have a commissioning agent, then you do have to do functional test sheets. And oftentimes they will build out their functional test in accordance with a commissioning plan. And this is where things can get messy. So up to this point, we've had a pretty clean submittal process, right? We've just followed the steps, we followed the sequence, we've followed the specification, and we followed the MEP set, and we're good to go. But along comes this commissioning agent with their commissioning test plan, and they've rewritten the sequences to what they think they should be. And this doesn't always happen, but this sometimes happens. And you need to be cognizant of this because your submittal documents can get approved because they follow the plan, and then your commissioning can get rejected because you followed the submittal documents and not the functional test and sequences that the commissioning agents drafted up. So you just got to be aware of this. And if you do have commissioning, owner rep or GC rep, partial or full commissioning, you want to be involved early on with them in drafting the functional test sheets and the functional tests themselves so that you, one, make sure your sequence can actually execute those functional tests, two, that they're not doing something that is just not realistic, and three, so that you don't have to go and last minute try to produce all this documentation that you simply can't produce quickly, because functional tests take time to write, especially if you're doing them right, which means that there's a success state, a failure state, there's an initiating state, and you've got to go and test all these different things. And if there's multiple failure states, then you've got to test those as well, and those are difficult to write well. And so that's something you need to be aware of. Whereas with functional tests that I'm talking about, where there's not a commissioning agent, we are simply going and breaking the sequence of operations out into chunks. So I like to have my occupancy initiation, I like to have my fan initiation, and then I like to have my different modes, cooling mode, heating mode, etc. And then I like to have my failure states. And that's kind of how I write out my functional tests. And that seems to work well for me. So to recap, how do we create submittals and project documents? Well, first, we need to know what is required. How do we find that? It's in the sequence of operations. I keep saying sequence of operations. It's in the specifications and the MEP set, as well as their scope of work. Once we find this information out, the submittals, which are generally in specification section 1, general, then we want to understand what is required for our submittal documents. What form do they need to be in? What size paper, electronic versus physical, how many copies, who they need to go to, what order do the documents need to be in. Follow the specification to the letter, but yet at the same time be cognizant of things, especially when it comes to the sequence, that don't make sense. So you can go and submit RFIs and RFCs. You want to follow the sequence or follow the specification. My gosh, that word's stuck in my head. You want to follow the specification to the letter while also being cognizant that some sequences will not work, and you need to address those on a case-by-case basis. Once you got the submittal set built out, then you also want to build out any auxiliary documentation like catalog sheets, installation docs, point-to-point checkout sheets, test and balance sheets if you're required to help support that, or if you self-execute test and balance, and functional test sheets and any integration tests. All right, if you have any questions about how to create submittals and project documents, I'd love to answer them for you. Please go to podcast.smartbuildingsacademy.com/285. It's there that you will find a link to our engineering course and our design course, and also the ability to submit your comments, because I'd love to hear your comments. Thanks a ton, and I'll talk to you on Wednesday when we go and actually start talking about how to line out your subcontractors. How do you get your subcontractors lined out so that they can execute your electrical work? How do you go and solicit subcontractors? How do you find the right one? What can you do from a training and development perspective from your subcontractors? What should you not do? And also some tips and tricks if you are self-executing instead of using electrical subs. Thanks a ton for listening, and I look forward to talking to you in the next episode. Take care.